When Joy Layden transitioned in 2008, a media firestorm erupted. Layden is a tenured professor of English at Yeshiva University, which bills itself as the oldest university in the United States to combine Jewish and secular learning. She was hailed in the media as the first transsexual teaching in an Orthodox yeshiva. The response from the institution was swift. Yeshiva University forced her to fight for her position, a fight in which she was ultimately successful. In addition to being a poet and a professor of English, Joy Layden is also, notably, an expert in trans studies and religion. In Layden's memoir, Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, she analyzes the press coverage of her transition. One of the most widely circulated news stories was an article that appeared in the New York Post entitled, Yeshiva University is Rattled by Transgender Prof, the second spelling, okay? The New York Post in general is not prone to offering thoughtful observations on gender and Judaism or much of anything else, but as Layden notes in her memoir, she became the punchline of the article. The pun, yeshiva, accomplished by changing an I to an E, is congruent with the tone of the rest of the newspaper. There were several other puns in that issue alone. And yet, in indulging in a pun about a trans woman, the New York Post is, unwittingly or not, participating in an established genre. This formulation of transsexuality offers an easy transphobic and misogynist laugh. The pun yeshiva becomes something much more than standard transphobia in the article, however. It functions as a pun about the incongruity of trans feminine bodies in Orthodox spaces. As Layden writes, this is number 1 on your handouts. But even for the Post, the joke of transsexuality is stale. Few New York area transsexuals make tabloid headlines. What made my story tabloid-worthy was the incongruity of a transsexual, the quintessence of a secular individualism that says that we are all free to define our identities, teaching at an institution for which identity, including gender, is defined in terms of divine law. Transsexuals in tight shirts and flirty skirts, no less, and Orthodox Jews. What could be funnier? As Layden explains, yeshiva renders Orthodox Judaism and trans as mutually exclusive terms. The she that disruptively breaks up yeshiva relies implicitly on a stereotype of Judaism as misogynistic and by extension transphobic. Now, I am not saying by any means that all forms of Judaism are feminist or transpositive, or that Judaism is never guilty of misogyny. I am, however, calling out the way transphobia and sexism is being assigned to Judaism. This move of framing Judaism as the originator of misogyny has its own anti-Semitic history within scholarship that I won't go into here, but if you're curious, you can ask me about in the Q of A. However, the article in its entirety displays all the classic hallmarks of both transphobia and misogyny. Through a phenomenal sleight of hand, then, at the same time, that article displaces that transphobia onto religion. To make the secular coverage in the Post transpositive, then, Judaism becomes the scapegoat. The tension between yeshiva and university, secular and religious modes, is mapped onto Judaism and transsexuality. In this formulation, as Layden herself notes, transsexual becomes secular, modern, neoliberal, and feminized, while Judaism is religious, sexist, legalistic, cisgender, and masculinized. Neither religion nor transsexuals fare well in this manufactured conflict. In my talk today, I'm going to weave together a reading of 3 very disparate texts. Mississippi House Bill 1523, one of the many anti-trans bills proposed in the last few years, a short excerpt from the Tosefta, a late antique Jewish, mostly legal compilation, and Joy Layden's theological meditations on the creation story in Genesis. All three texts are grounded in their own time and place. At the same time, all three are also taking a theoretical stance on the congruity of diverse gender subjectivities in religious traditions. The thread that runs throughout this slightly wild jaunt through time is a series of reflections on the terms religion, law, and trans themselves. We see in the mainstream media's treatment of Layden an implicit and not uncommon assertion that trans and religion are mutually exclusive terms. Underneath this formulation of the conflict lie some basic assumptions. The baseline of religion is hostile to transgender people, for example. Religion has the power to choose to admit trans people or not. The corollary is also therefore implicitly suggested. Cisgender people may be incorporated into religion without difficulty. The term cisgender names those people whose experiences of gender agree with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So basically, in the most common way the term is used, it's a way to designate non-trans people. I'm going to use it slightly differently. Throughout my talk, I want to ask us to consider the impacts of this constructed incongruity between religion and transgender, and using the frame of cisgender as a model, I want to turn mainstream logic on its head. Instead of asking whether religion can incorporate trans people, I ask, must religion be cisgender, or can religion be trans? Mississippi House Bill 1523 seeks to regulate trans people's access to public facilities. It's an ironic moment to be giving this talk. It was passed in 2016 and joined in court in the summer of 2016, a day before the law was supposed to go into effect. That injunction was just overturned in June, and the law actually went into effect today. So this is currently the law in the state of Mississippi, as of today. Currently, the law is still in the process of being challenged by multiple suits. Hopefully it's going to head to the Supreme Court next, including a suit by the Campaign for Public Equality and the Joshua Generation Metropolitan Community Church, along with several other individual parties. Mississippi House Bill 1523 is just one of a number of bathroom bills proposed in the U.S., which were in turn a part of a legislative slate of over 100 anti-LGBT bills proposed in 2016 alone. The proposed laws range in their effects. Some of them include jail time, and the penalties vary widely as well. The subset of bills addressing access to public facilities for trans people have been popularly dubbed bathroom bills. It's not immediately obvious why discussion has focused so much on the space of the bathroom as opposed to, say, locker rooms and other public facilities that are also typically designated single-sex. The tactic of referring to them as bathroom bills seems designed to play off a long history of white supremacist fears organized around the protection of certain classes of women. At the same time, calling them bathroom bills simultaneously trivializes the laws as if bathrooms are unimportant spaces. Instead of trivial space, I would argue, bathrooms have been at the heart of political struggle in U.S. history. Well, I will refer to Mississippi House Bill 1523 as what I believe it is, an anti-trans bill, among other things. I reject the notion that the issue of access to bathroom is trivial from either a trans studies perspective, religious studies, disability studies, or frankly, a Jewish ethical perspective. The opening clauses of Mississippi House Bill 1523 define what specific religious beliefs are protected. The first two protected religious beliefs are number 2 on your handout, A and B. A, marriage is or should be recognized as the union of one man and one woman. B, sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. So within the context of the bill, protected religious belief is defined as both heterosexual and monogamous. The language of is or should be in the first clause, everyone see that? Marriage is or should be recognized, is evocative of a wish to reframe heterosexual marriage, even as the law protects the belief in that reframing. There is a kind of gap between an ideal and a reality built into the texture of the language itself. A type of melancholic longing for a different social fabric. There is more to say here, but a full exploration of the marriage section is outside of the scope of my argument today. For our purposes, the third clause warrants closer attention. It reads, male, and in parentheses, man or female, woman, refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy and genetics at time of birth. The third clause establishes that sex and gender identity must be both regulated and assigned at birth. In my reading, this pairing of the first two, A and B and C, heterosexual monogamy and binary gender, is not accidental. The regulation of trans bodies in space is necessitated by a complementarian theology, in which God creates two sexes that are counterparts in marriage and the figures of Adam and Eve. Therefore, in the service of heterosexuality, the regulation of sexuality and gender identity must go hand in hand. We see this exact same complementarian theology undergirding, for example, the recent Nashville statement, which is why I feel pretty confident that it's what's the theology that's undergirding Mississippi House Bill 1523. The third clause argues that sex is objectively determined at birth. Let us leave aside the fact that genetic testing is not standard practice on all newborns, so it is not entirely clear what the bill is referring to when it argues that sex is established objectively through genetics at birth. Let us also pass over the notion that anatomy and genetics always align, a point many intersex activists might take issue with. The wording of the rest of the clause bears careful scrutiny. The parentheses between male and man, right? The parentheses renders the two terms male and man one entity, and the same with female and woman. By collapsing the terms for sex with the terms for gender identity, the two become entwined. On the one hand, this move rejects any easy distinctions between sex and gender. For those of you familiar with Butler's work, this is an argument we might be used to hearing from other more feminist theoretical quarters. However, it is a rejection predicated on the belief that there is an objective sex-gender identity that is biological, unchangeable, and determined at birth. The language of biology and genetic testing also introduces a question of science into a bill designed to protect and define religious belief. Science and religion collude to determine the immutable truth of sex at birth. When the bill entwines the scientific and the theological, the law conspires to naturalize a divinely ordained gender binary. All right, I'll say it another way. In the process of defining protected classes of conscience, that's the name of the bill, the state of Mississippi has also ruled that it is a religious belief that science objectively and immutably establishes both sex and gender at birth. In other words, it's a religious belief that science says that transsexuals cannot exist. If you're scratching your heads, you are not alone. Trans bodies, trans identities, trans subjectivities cannot exist in the cosmology of Mississippi House Bill 1523. Science, law, religion, and theology are marshaled in order to represent trans as utterly unintelligible. In consequence, as the rest of the bill goes on to describe, discrimination, in particular refusing services to certain people on the grounds of your religious beliefs, is transmogrified. Instead of discrimination, it is simply the material instantiation of a protected religious belief that trans people are an impossibility. It is manifesting into reality the religious belief in the gender binary. It is closing that melancholic gap between religious ideals and sexual and gendered mores. There is way more to unpack here than I have time for today, but one point that follows from this imbrication of religion, law, secularity, science, publics, and trans access to bathrooms. When Mississippi House Bill 1523 understands morality as being religiously and scientifically opposed to transsexual bodies, law and religion are being cisgendered. To review the term, cisgender is usually used to refer to those people whose gender identities agree with the sex that they were assigned at birth. I'm using cisgender here atypically as a verb, although more in line with what I think it was its original context when it was coined. What happens when we refuse the presupposition woven into this bill that religion must needs be essentially hostile to trans people? If we do not accept that hypothesis as a given, we may instead marvel at the bill's overkill, the overabundance of forces all arrayed in collusion to render trans bodies illegible, all in the service of cisgendering religion. When we travel back in time to late antiquity, there is no precise cognate for either the term cisgender or transgender. The words may require some contextual retranslation. However, the questions I'm posing to the texts are similar. If we do not assume rabbinic texts are essentially hostile to non-binary bodies and subjectivities, what then may we learn about rabbinic approaches to non-binary gender? Can we detect any comparable efforts to cisgender the tradition? The rabbis have their own gendered cosmology. They both devised and borrowed terms to describe gender diversity. While my book project addresses several of these categories, and there are several of these categories, and they show up quite frequently in the texts, for today we're just going to focus briefly on one, the androgynos. The term androgynos, as it is employed in rabbinic literature, generally is understood to refer to a person with two sets of genitalia. The most programmatic text on the androgynos can be attributed to the Tosefta, which is an early legal compilation. End of 2nd century, early 3rd century. They like to debate a lot in my field. Following the standard format of Tannaitic lists, the text begins with a topic statement, and this is number 3 on your list. The topic statement is going to introduce the 4 sections of the text that will immediately follow. The androgynos is in some ways like men, is in some ways like women, is in some ways like both men and women, and is in some ways not like men or women. And you'll see androgynos yesh bo drachim shaveh le'anashim. That piece underneath is the Hebrew for those who want it. Following this heading, the text is divided into these same 4 sections that will enumerate the gendered laws that apply to the androgynos. In the first section, for example, the androgynos functions legally as a man in that they become ritually impure through seminal emissions, like men do. They must uphold all of the positive commandments in the Torah. By implication, this includes mitzvat aseh she'ezman grama, positive time-bound commandments, which usually women are excluded from. The androgynos can marry but not be married like men. For those of you with the Hebrew, noseh avalon nisa, you can hear the active and passive in the Hebrew itself, which has been interpreted to mean that they can initiate a marriage contract with a woman like men do, but cannot be married, a phrase that is grammatically in the passive, like women are to a man. The active and passive verb forms work to succinctly convey a whole set of gendered and sexual expectations, not just for the androgynos, but also for normative masculinity and the restrictions on women in the text. Charlotta von Robert uses the legal ruling of nosea valonisa, marries but is not married, to point out that the rabbis are privileging the androgynos' male genitalia, indicating an overall preference towards understanding the androgynos as mostly male. Sarah Lev, in contrast, has argued that the list is formulated to apply the stringencies of all the laws of the categories of male and female, and that for the rabbis, a sexual union between two potential men constitutes a greater legal challenge than a sexual union between two potential women. The list continues to spell out the ways the androgynos is like a woman. For example, they become impure through menstruation, like women. In Hebrew, the language used for menstruation and seminal emissions in this text is by color. So the androgynos is said to become impure through both red and white, which emphasizes a kind of parallelism between gendered impurity and subjects the androgynos to both sets of legal expectations. We might question whether those things are actually parallel, given the rabbinic expansion of restrictions on women and menstrual impurity. The androgynous is also subject to some of the same legal restrictions that women are. For example, they cannot bear legal witness. The third section enumerates the ways the androgynos is like both men and women. Laws that apply to both men and women are essentially exceptions to the highly gendered nature of rabbinic law. These laws apply to all humans. So, for example, if the androgynos is injured, they are entitled to damages like both men and women. If they are killed, the killer is treated in exactly the same as in any other case of manslaughter. I will note, but not dwell here, on the fact that the category of both is closest to our notion of human rights. Injuring an androgynos is like injuring any other human being. There are two caveats to this point, however. The category of rights is not at all native to rabbinic conceptualizations of law, and in fact can impede our ability to understand the rabbinic legal project. Moreover, I would point out that human rights in the cases I just mentioned, it's bought at a high cost, namely the cost of violence to the androgynos. In this case, then, the androgynos' humanity is constituted through harm. The final section details the ways in which the androgynos is not like either men or women, without getting too far into technical legal details. For example, this part of the list includes a ruling that if someone makes a Nazirite vow and that the androgynos is neither a man nor a woman, the vow is valid. That person becomes a Nazir. Here we have an example of someone trying to pinpoint the gender of the androgynos, and the first straightforward assertion that the androgynos does not, in some fundamental way, fit into binary gender. Note that this is not a question of self-identification. They're not asking the androgynos, how do you identify? But rather a legal question. Generalizations about rabbinic law are dangerous as a rule. It is safe to assert the generalization that rabbinic law is a highly gendered legal system. The gender of participants in a case is almost always relevant information for that case. In the context of this intensely gendered legal system, the androgynos presents unique challenges. While this list represents a prosaic debate over the status of the androgynos in relation to specific laws, it also raises broader questions that border on the ontological. Is the androgynos somehow essentially different? Can Jewish law incorporate the body of the androgynos? What's the cost of this incorporation into the law? In rabbinic law, this is another generalization that I also think is fair enough. The ideal legal subject is the one with the most obligations under the law. Therefore, by listing the way that the androgynos can take on certain obligations like men and women can, the text essentially assimilates the androgynos into Rabbinic Judaism. There may be some difficulties in actually following the law. According to the rabbis, the laws of Yichud, the androgynos is not permitted to be alone with either men or women, for example. But at least there is some kind of effort to think through how the androgynos can participate in the endeavor of rabbinic law. At the same time, however, the rhetorical strategy of this list fragments the androgynos into component pieces. The essential poles of men and women still stand, for the most part, uncontested, as the rabbis position the androgynos legally as like men and women. Following the list, we have a punchline, a coda, which takes a different approach from the following. This is a 4 on your handout on the back. Rabbi Yossi disagreed. The androgynos is a creation unto themselves, birya le'atzmo or le'atzman, depending on the manuscript. And the sages could not decide about them whether he is a man or she is a woman. And if anyone has questions about translation issues, because there's a lot of translation issues with these texts and gender, feel free to quiz me about that later. In this coda, Rabbi Yossi disagrees with the approach of the 4-sectioned list. In his view, to participate in the law, the sages would have had to pick a sex for the androgynos, designate the androgynos as either a man or a woman. This strategy of designating a legal sex was in fact practiced in some areas of Roman law. So it's not outside the bounds of possibility. However, that inclusion of the phrase creation unto themselves, birya, which is the same root as breshit for those of you familiar, seems not to indicate just a kind of legal sex, a legal fiction that would enable the androgynos to participate in the law, but rather a kind of category problem. The sages cannot designate a sex for the androgynos because the androgynos is sui generis. Since they could not assign a sex, as evidenced by their enumerations of the different legal roles, the implication is the androgynos cannot participate in the law at all. Rabbi Yossi's statement sits uneasily alongside the approach that precedes it, attempting to undo the work of carefully fitting the androgynos into law. Charlotte von Robert, in reading the text, argues that while a diversity of sexed bodies is admissible in rabbinic law, they must ultimately conform to the gender binary of laws. So you can have a range of sexed bodies, but ultimately the rabbis need them to perform in the legal gender binary. She's privileging the approach of the sages over Rabbi Yossi and claims that a demonstration of the discursive strength and flexibility of halakha, of the law, requires that the legal system be able to incorporate even the body of the androgynos. On the back of the androgynos, then, the sages demonstrate the power of their legal system to treat every issue that might arise. By arguing that the rabbis choose the comprehensiveness of law, von Robert is choosing the sages, not Rabbi Yossi. I find her argument compelling, but I would frame it slightly differently. Both the list and Rabbi Yossi support binary gender. In that sense, both the list and Rabbi Yossi's position collude. They simply disagree on the relationship between sex and gender. While for the sages, sexed bodily diversity is admissible because they can force you to conform to a gendered legal binary, for Rabbi Yossi, sex and gender are collapsed with a very radically different outcome for the androgynos. Both the sages and Rabbi Yossi, however, establish that gender in law must be binary for the rabbis. This collusion by the sages and Rabbi Yossi is hidden underneath their apparent disagreement. As a result of this incomplete banishment of the androgynos from law, debates over gender variance will continue to trouble rabbinic discussions for centuries to come. Rabbi Yossi, in labeling the androgynos sui generis, or a creation unto themselves, rhetorically positions the androgynos as unique, as the exception that proves the binary rule. We do not have to accept this assertion as fact. We do not have to relegate the androgynes to the margins of the text. Rather, in my larger argument, this debate over the exclusion of the androgynes is at the heart of establishing binary gender in Tannaitic literature, in early rabbinic literature. The collusion between the sages and Rabbi Yossi works to instill binary gender as essential to the law. It is therefore on the back of the androgynes that the system of normative gender is built. At its heart, then, one might understand this text to be an attempt to cisgender the rabbinic tradition. I want to return us to the terrible pun of yeshiva for the final section of my talk. The coverage of Joy Ladin's transition in the New York Post is a concise and straightforward representation of the cisgendering of religion. When the article makes a joke of Joy, the humor only works if the reader already understands that religion is no place for a trans woman. While we have explored the way the coverage is a primer of transphobia and the cisgendering of religion, it is also specifically an example of transmisogyny. And this is number 5 on your handout. Julia Serrano succinctly defines transmisogyny as when a trans person is ridiculed or dismissed, not merely for failing to live up to gender norms, but for their expression of femaleness or femininity. This regulation of the category of female is a central facet of transmisogyny. We can see some of these regulatory strategies employed in the press coverage of Ladin's transition. Reading closely the article in the Post will mean exploring some deeply transphobic and transmisogynist writing. But I also hope that it will demonstrate for us what is at stake in all of our scholarship in recognizing transmisogyny and the cisgendering of religion. So in this last section of my talk, I will read closely some small sections of the New York Post, and then I'm going to turn to the theological writings of Ladin herself. Remember the premise of the article, that simple substitution of an I for an E, that changes yeshiva, a traditional space of Jewish learning, into yeshiva, a space that has been disruptively interrupted by a woman. Technically, actually, Joy Ladin teaches at Stern College, which is the women's college associated with Yeshiva University, and which is one of the oldest centers in the U.S. for Orthodox women's learning. Yeshiva learning, traditional learning, is also historically a masculine preserve, so the misspelled she at the center of the Post's pun is doubly ironic in a Jewish context. Via the simple substitution of the letter, the Post inadvertently wanders into the complicated gendered politics of Jewish learning. If the she in yeshiva disrupts masculine space, then this theme of disruptive femininity continues in the text of the article itself. The article begins, and I'm going to quote from it, but I didn't actually want to reproduce it more, so I didn't give you it on your handout. It's fairly easy to follow. Literature professor Joy Ladin, formerly known as J. Ladin, 47, showed up for her first day of school sporting pink lipstick, a tight purple shirt, and a flirty black skirt. She cheerfully strutted through the doors of the Midtown campus's main building where she oversees the writing center. The phrase, formerly known as accompanied by before and after pictures, well, you don't need a PhD in trans religion to know that that's probably incredibly disrespectful and transphobic. This idea of outing trans women's assigned sex is built on a deeply problematic and often dangerous idea that transsexual bodies lie. Paradoxically, then, in a classic transmisogynist fashion, the Post throws doubt on Ladin's femininity, before and after pictures, her former name, etc., while at the same time highlighting her femininity through sexism, in particular a sexist running commentary on Ladin's choice of clothing that day. A reporter commenting on a woman's clothes and not her own expert opinions on Judaism and trans religion, or where she earned her PhD, surely facts as germane to the article as her outfit that day, is a persistent and banal form of sexism. And yet, not only is Leyden characterized through her clothes, but she is also hypersexualized. The skirt itself is flirty, as if her clothes are animated and become a metonym for her conspicuous trans body, as if her gender itself constitutes a sexual transgression. In the portrayal of the post, her body struts, is painted on with lipstick, and seemingly obliviously, cheerfully interrupts the space of the yeshiva. Given the misogynist hypersexualization of trans women's bodies, this flirty skirt does not exist in a vacuum. In acknowledging Leyden's femininity, it is as if the author cannot then seem to look away. Her femininity is rendered more conspicuous, more presumptuous. Transmisogyny, therefore, functions to distill and amplify the conflation of women as sex and body. At the same time, Leyden is figured as inserting herself within a context alien to her, an orthodox institution. The description of her appearance slyly implies that her clothes are perhaps inappropriate or unprofessional for a professor at Stern College, an idea which online commentators discussing the article certainly picked up on. While a skirt is standard for women in an orthodox context, the descriptors tight and flirty do not necessarily fit with the rules of tzniut, of modesty. Leyden's femininity is figured as fundamentally inappropriate, even offensive to Orthodox Jewish space. Rika Aoki, an author, performer, and professor, delivered an address at the 2016 Association of Writers and Writing Programs as part of a panel of trans authors discussing magic and religion. In her talk, she describes what I would call the cisgendering of religion. This is number 6 on your handout. Somewhere between the "and then there was light" and "yo, don't eat pork and go circumcise yourselves" was the man and woman thing. Male and female happen, but why do they happen? Cis folks don't really notice this omission, since they don't tend to question their gender so much, but trans people do. Not merely why did God make man and woman, but why did God make sex and gender anyway? It's not that I need intervention, prophecy, either magical or divine, to conquer some quest or save the world. The universe hasn't turned against us. We are in a universe that had no room for us in the first place. Aoki alludes here to the creation story recorded in the book of Genesis. She implicitly recognizes the ways that Genesis has been used to characterize trans people, trans subjectivities as unnatural or irreligious. Trans people never had to be excluded. Instead, cisgendered cosmology precludes trans existence. In the context of a world that is undergirded by the structuring forces of a homicidal, transphobic racism, taking aim at trans women of color in particular, there is a concerted effort to manifest this cosmology materially. Aoki informs us that within a universe that had no room for her in the first place, the mundanities of a trans of color life are divine. Her trans cosmology is formed out of fundamentally different questions. Joy Leyden also takes up the question of trans theology and cosmology in her writing. Her forthcoming book, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, addresses directly the creation story in Genesis. In its entirety, Leyden meditates extensively on the creation narratives and issues important correctives to the kinds of complementarian theologies that we see propping up Mississippi House Bill 1523 or the Nashville Statement and other conservative readings of trans people and religion. I want to draw our attention, however, to one small detail from this argument, her explication of the concept of tselem Elohim, being created in the image of God. This is number 7 on your handout. The question, what aspects of humanity reflect our kinship with our bodiless creator, is at the heart of what I now recognize as my personal version of trans theology. not because it is a question specific to transgender people, but because being transgender forced me to search for aspects of my own humanity that weren't dependent on my body or the meanings others gave it. To me, whether or not we are transgender, we engage in trans theology whenever we try to look past sex and gender, bodies and binaries, to understand what in humanity reflects the image of God. While Aoki positions trans theology as posing fundamentally different questions, Leiden's strategy is different. Trans theology, in her argument, rehearses classical theological questions from a different vantage point. Leiden roots her trans theology within her tradition and refuses to position trans bodies, peoples, cosmologies as in any way external to her religious tradition. As a corrective, Leiden's theology invites us to rethink fundamental Jewish concepts, like the question of Tselem Elohim. I am not intending to adjudicate between the approaches of Aoki and Leiden. Instead, I am inviting us into their conversation. Our work must be changed through an encounter with Leiden's transing of central Jewish theological concepts, or Aoki's redefinition of the categories of the divine and the mundane. How crucial in this political moment that we as scholars and community members begin to engage these voices. Must religion be cisgendered, or can religion be trans? If we accept the underlying assumption that religion and trans bodies are in some way mutually incompatible, then we inherit a deeply impoverished definition of religion. We collude with the same logics that dictate the creation of publics as white, able-bodied, sex-segregated, and cisgender spaces. And we adopt cosmologies that write trans people out of existence. We collude with the logics of transmisogyny that render trans women jokes and as always something less than human. If trans religion is an oxymoron, we recapitulate the formulation of religion as anachronistic and solely misogynistic, and preserve secularism as the realm of neoliberal choice and progress. If we do not actively upend these understandings of trans religion, we remain complicit in a logic that diminishes the possibilities of both trans and religion. Thank you.